Hey all, this is Redditosker, and today we're going to be reviewing Sea of Stars, a retro-inspired turn-based RPG developed by Sabotage Studios. My early review copy of the game was provided by them. Now, what got me interested in Sea of Stars is that Sabotage Studios is also the company responsible for The Messenger. Sabotage is an indie company, and The Messenger was their first project, and I really liked it. It was a side-scrolling action platformer inspired by Ninja Gaiden. And what caught my attention is that the game did a very good job of capturing what was good about Ninja Gaiden. It seemed to me that the developers understood Ninja Gaiden, they understood the elements that it had that made it good, and they effectively extracted that and packaged it in a form that was palatable to a modern audience. They made this type of game appealing even for people who had no interest in that genre and were not going to go back and play one of those games. And it seems that this company has decided that that's their thing. If you go to the Sea of Stars website and you looked at their Q&A section, it says, "We love many different game genres, and are on a quest to create our own versions of the ones that are dearest to us." There's a similar sentiment in the Sabotage Studio website, where they say, "Sabotage's mission was always clear, to create our own definitive editions of the game genres we enjoyed as kids." I think they definitely achieved that goal with The Messenger, and I was very excited for Sea of Stars. Because Sea of Stars is radically different than The Messenger. This time the genre that they're tackling is turn-based RPG in the style of Chrono Trigger. And I love Chrono Trigger. So I was very eager to see if they could pull it off again, and successfully extract and repackage the things that made games like Chrono Trigger so appealing in the past. Let's begin by talking about combat. There are no random encounters in this game. All the enemies are visible as you approach them, and you fight them in the same physical area that you see them. There's no transition into a different screen. The combat itself sports several interesting gimmicks. First of all, enemies display above their heads how many actions you can take before the enemy does his action. Anytime you perform an action with one of your characters, that timer goes down. For basic attacks, enemies will just have the timer over their head and there's nothing you can do to stop their attack other than killing them. But if the enemy or boss wants to do a more impressive attack, they'll often have several different icons over their head in addition to the timer that tells you when the attack is going to come out. These icons will be of various elemental and physical damage types. They are called locks, and hitting the enemy with a physical or elemental damage type that corresponds with these locks will break the lock. If you manage to break all of the locks before the enemy does his attack, then that attack will be cancelled. Obviously, it's best to break all the locks and cancel the attack if you can, but it's still worthwhile to attempt it even if you can't get every single one. As with every lock broken, the damage that attack would do is reduced. Planning to break these locks is possible because your side of the field doesn't really have a turn order. You can choose to attack with whatever allies you have. Only 3 of them can be on the field at a time, but once you get more than 3, you'll be able to swap them out and attack during combat without penalty. Although there is also kind of a turn order, because once you use one of your 3 characters, their icon will be grayed out and you won't be able to use that character again until you use the other 2. And then once all 3 of your characters are used, you can again choose to attack with any one of them in any order. The combat is fairly engaging thanks to these locks, but also, probably more importantly, thanks to the Paper Mario button timings. Like in Paper Mario, if you attack an enemy and press the button again right before the attack lands, you'll do a second attack and bonus damage. And if you block just as an enemy's attack is about to hit you, you'll reduce the damage the enemy does to you. Your skills also have different timings. Some of them will have you hold the button until you need to release it at the right moment. Some of them will have you repeat the timing at the proper time over and over, and the attack will continue until you miss. For the timings of your character, you pretty much have the entire game to learn the timings, so for sure you'll get those. And they're actually quite important because they will affect how effectively you can break locks. Timing the normal attack correctly to an enemy will do a second attack, which means breaking 2 locks of that respective element. And likewise, some of your magic skills will continue to hit the enemy over and over, which means if you do it effectively enough, you will be able to break all the enemy locks of that element. As for blocking enemies' attacks, that's a lot less important. It does reduce the amount of damage an enemy's attacks will do to you, but not to the point that you absolutely need to block every attack. And the game goes out of its way early on to tell you not to feel bad if you can't get an enemy's timing. and that you should just see it as a nice bonus. The point of it really seems to be just to keep you interested in what's going on in the fight. Which is good because there's not that many reused enemies in areas. Like I said before, there's no random encounters, so the number of times you'll fight a given type of enemy is quite limited, since they'll usually be exclusive to the area that you're in. Once you go to a new area, a new dungeon, a new place to explore, that new place will have different enemies, and those enemies will have different animations and different timings to their attacks, which doesn't give you much of an opportunity to get bored with blocking things, since by the time you really master an enemy's attack pattern, the level is probably going to be over soon, and you're unlikely to see that enemy again. They really don't overstay their welcome. Now, another interesting thing about the combat is how magic works. It works normally, it works how you'd expect. You have magic points, and you have skills, and those skills cost magic points. But you don't have many magic points. In the beginning of the game, you have like 9, and your magic attacks will cost like 7 or 8 of them. So you can't spam them really. Even at the end of the game, the most magic points I had was like 20. The reason for this, I think, is to prevent you from doing the standard JRPG thing where you save all your magic points for the boss, and then you use all your strongest spells over and over until it goes down. Instead, what they did in this game is they have you replenish some of your magic every time you do a normal attack. You'll get 3 magic points back every time you do one. The point of this is to have you alternate between attacks and spells. It's an incentive to bring variety. It makes you use spells outside of bosses so you don't feel like you're missing out on potential mana regeneration. If you attack and your mana is already full, that's regeneration you're wasting. And for the actual bosses, these spells are valuable because they can break locks. So you have to develop a pacing and make decisions. Do you use them to do some damage and then recover magic over time? Or do you save them to try and break the enemy locks that might appear? It's a good system. It had me thoughtful for most boss battles, and even some random battles had me, aware. There's a lot of stuff in the game that I think is just to prevent you from doing the normal JRPG thing that people would do. So for example, the way that healing items work. A lot of the times people save up on elixirs or a bunch of powerful healing items and then they use them up only during the boss battles. Or maybe not even during the boss battles, they'll just save them all the way till the end of the game and never use them. I think they wanted to avoid that, and so what they did was you can only hold 10 healing items at a time, and these healing items are food. At any campsite, you can cook up the food based on what ingredients you have and what recipes you've collected, and different foods have a variety of different healing effects. You can use them in battle, but again, you only have 10 of them. So I often found myself using some of them during the dungeon, not just for the boss. There's a lot of systems in the game that want you to make use of them right that moment. And if you choose not to, it'll be kind of a waste since they're a temporary currency. For example, there's living magic. When you attack an enemy with a normal attack, a little bunch of orbs will appear. You can absorb those orbs and use them to power up a different attack, or you can power up your normal attack and add an elemental attribute to that normal attack. You can get up to 3 of these orbs to linger in the battlefield, and you can use them at your convenience. These are useful because sometimes an enemy will have a lock that will require you to, for example, do 2 instances of slashing damage and 1 instance of sun damage to break the lock and prevent the attack. And it'll do that attack the next turn, like right now. So you need to break it immediately. Well, you can do that. The living magic spheres that are on the ground will add the elemental attribute that that character is known for to his attacks. The sun main character does slashing damage and sun damage, so if you give him an orb of living magic and tell him to attack the enemy with a normal attack, he'll do an instance of slashing damage and sun damage. And if you mark the normal attack timings, he'll do another attack, which means he'll do 2 instances of slashing damage and sun damage, which was enough to break the lock. Combat also has a combo meter. So as the fight progresses, you'll build up combo points. This allows 2 different allies to make combination attacks. You can build up to 3 combo points, and different combination attacks require different number of combo points. Like the living magic, these go away after the combat ends, so you're encouraged to make use of them during the fight. even if it's just against normal enemies. They don't require magic to use, and can be very useful for breaking complicated enemy locks. For example, one of the earliest ones that you get is a combo attack between the two main characters. It only costs 1 point, and it has each of them just do a normal attack. But that has a surprising number of benefits, because you can do the timing with these normal attacks, and they'll both do a second bonus attack. Which means that for the purposes of breaking locks, you're doing 2 instances of slashing damage and 2 instances of blood damage. And if you use living magic on whatever character is initiating that combo attack, that character's element will also be in the mix, potentially letting you break 5 different locks at a time. And because it's a normal attack, both of those characters regain 3 MP. Later in the game, you get a third combat-exclusive currency, which are each character's ultimate attack. This also builds up throughout the fight and is removed once the fight is over. There's just a lot of systems that incentivize you to be present in these battles. You can't really turn your brain off and button mash here. At least not if you want to be effective. Which brings me finally to the game's difficulty. Let's talk about that. The game doesn't have an easy mode or a hard mode, but it does have ways to modify your challenge. Throughout the game you can get things called relics, and those can be turned on and off in the options menu to modify your game experience. I think you can find more as the game progresses, but initially you do have what's probably the easy mode, Amulet, which doubles your character's HP and automatically heals them after combat. I think there are also relics that make the game harder, or make slight tweaks to combat, but I didn't use any relics or go out of my way to try and find any, because I wanted to review just the normal intended difficulty, which I'll do now. It's weird. The game has a really nice flow at the speed at which you can get through these encounters, and the speed of moving through the environment. We'll talk about the environments and movement in a bit, but everything flows smoothly. I felt like I was constantly moving. And most of the time it wasn't really hard per se. In fact, it was a really long time before I ever died. And even if you do die, it doesn't put you back at your latest save point. It'll put you at a nearby checkpoint if you haven't saved for a while. So I wasn't terribly worried, and it got to the point where I just didn't save at all. I'd go a whole session without saving. But what's strange about it is that enemies actually do a decent amount of damage. And you are using up resources that are valuable as you progress through dungeons, not just at bosses. So you're healing throughout the level, wasting your magic points throughout the level, using food if you have no magic points to spend throughout the level to keep yourself topped off. And what I found that is occasionally a group of random enemies that I've killed like half a dozen times already suddenly just wipes my party. And what I've attributed this to isn't that the enemies suddenly did more damage, it's just that I kind of lost focus. If you're paying attention and you're taking advantage of all the different resources available to you in combat, and you're competently breaking enemy locks, effectively allocating the decisions of what moves when, then yeah, the combat can be easy. That's how it's supposed to go. But the moment that I stopped paying attention because I thought it was easy, you realize, oh, these enemies do a lot of damage and they have a lot of wide area attacks, and if you don't break their locks, some of these attacks can be devastating, and you should really focus on getting rid of the dangerous ones quickly. So basically my impression of the difficulty is it's not hard, but it can suddenly get hard if you don't pay attention. Let's talk about the atmosphere and traversal of the game. Starting with graphics. As you can see, as you've probably seen throughout this whole video, it looks fantastic. It looks gorgeous. I find it difficult to believe it could look better. Everything from the backgrounds, to the character animations, to the enemy animations, to all of the subtle effects that things have, is just great. It's great. I think it's the best looking of any of the Chrono Trigger likes that have come out over the years. I also really like the music. I'm not really a person that describes music very well, but I know what I like, I know what I think is good, and this I think is good. They even managed to work with Yasunori Mitsuda. 10 of the game's tracks came from him. Mitsuda is a legendary composer who has done the music for some of my favorite game soundtracks, including Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Xenosaga 1, Chrono Cross. I think he also did the soundtrack for Xenoblade 2 and 3. The lead composer in Sea of Stars also did an excellent job. I don't actually know which tracks are Yasunori's and which aren't, But what I can say is that I never had a moment where I think, this music's kind of bad. And I did have several moments where I thought, wow, these pieces are really good. This is excellent. It's very atmospheric. Finally, let's talk about the world of traversal. The moment that you start playing, you will quickly realize that you're a lot less restricted than you thought you were. Turn-based JRPGs of this type typically have you moving on a grid. You're very restricted in how you can move. That's not true here. It does not feel like you're on a grid. It doesn't even feel like you're playing a JRPG. It feels like a platformer. If there's a ledge, you can jump off of it and get to whatever's below. You can climb on things, but you can also hoist yourself and vault over small obstacles. You can jump into any water and swim around. You're not bound by the typical things that you would expect to be bound. You can definitely tell that these are the same people that made The Messenger. It feels a lot like The Messenger a lot of the times. It comes through with the speed and fluidity in which you go through content. At one point you'll get a little knife on a rope, and you can use that to pull yourself towards objects or fling past them, or to get the advantage on enemies in combat. And it is just not normal. It is not what you expect from a Chrono Trigger-like game, but it's a happy surprise. It feels great to move around. Alright, let's talk about the game's story. In a lot of ways, that's the important issue. I could forgive a lot about everything else if the story is sufficient. When I play turn-based RPGs, it is usually not for the gameplay. The gameplay is often secondary for me. It's the story that I care about. It's the story that motivates me to progress further. So at this point, I'm going to give my first spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about the story from this point forward. If you want to go in blind, you can stop the video here. For the following part, I'm going to be talking about the game's premise. So there'll be very early game spoilers, I suppose. After which I'm going to give you a second spoiler warning. And that second spoiler will be the serious spoiler warning. So once you get that second spoiler warning, you should just go away if you don't want to hear any of that. Alright, so the game's premise is that the two main characters that you play as are the children of the solstice. They are special children that are born in the summer solstice or the winter solstice. These children are capable of using eclipse magic, the only magic capable of hurting the minions of an evil alchemist known as the Fleshmancer. As such, these children are taken in and raised to become solstice warriors, so that they one day go out and fulfill their duty. The creatures that they hunt are known as dwellers, and these dwellers are only vulnerable during an eclipse. The initial goal is that after you have completed your training, you're sent off, along with other solstice warriors, to deal with the last remaining dweller left in the world. So that's the initial premise. Now technically, Sea of Stars is a prequel to The Messenger. In fact, from what you can gather in the game's website, the studio intends to have all of their games take place in this same shared universe. You don't need to have played The Messenger to enjoy Sea of Stars, but I really recommend that you do. There are a lot of impactful moments and connections and references that won't be as impactful or have any emotional weight to them without having played previous games. And the games are really, really connected. They really mean it when they say that these games take place in a shared universe. Like, I'm willing to bet there's a master document over there with a gigantic timeline in which games like The Messenger and Sea of Stars are tiny pieces of. And it's not just references to The Messenger, there are things that were mysteries in The Messenger that are more clear in Sea of Stars. And things that didn't seem like mysteries that have been recontextualized and you're like, oh, well that's what that meant. And there's still even things that are definitely connected, but the implications aren't clear of what those connections are. It is a very big, mysterious thing. And I'm positive you'll enjoy both games a lot more if you play The Messenger before you try Sea of Stars. I know that the developers are like, no, it's a standalone, you can play it without having played The Messenger. No, I don't agree. I think The Messenger is required for this. And part of that is because the most interesting thing about the story in Sea of Stars is that it seems to be going somewhere. It's not just a gimmick that it's connected to The Messenger. There's a large overarching plot across games, across genres, that I believe it's leading to. Alright, now for my actual thoughts on the story of the game specifically. I didn't really like it. Now, I didn't hate it either, but I did find myself disappointed. What I enjoyed was what I described earlier, the world building. I'm heavily invested in this shared universe, I'm invested in the lore, but I found myself having trouble getting invested in these specific characters or the story that they go through. I still recommend the game, but I only recommend it to people who are big fans of these turn-based JRPGs, like Chrono Trigger. Whereas in The Messenger, I thought that game's appeal was wide enough that I would recommend it to people that have never played a Ninja Gaiden, don't care about Ninja Gaiden or Metroidvanias or platformers. And the reason I don't find Sea of Stars as compelling is the story. Everything else it does is of the highest quality. It really is just the story that it lost me at. In order to better explain why, I'll have to give my second spoiler warning now. If you don't want some more spoilers, you should consider this the end of the review. Okay? Alright. Now that they're gone, I'm still going to try and be vague, but I'll talk about some of the problems I had with the narrative. My biggest problem is that I still don't know really what's going on with a lot of the game. The main antagonist's central goal is not revealed. Over the course of the main story, it's not really talked about. I might still know what it is, but it's mentioned in a bit of optional dialogue. And it's really just one line. And if it is what I'm thinking about, it's such a simple reason that it's kind of disappointing. Character motivations really are a big part of my problem. There's other villains that are central to the story, whose motivations just don't make sense to me. The reason that they're bad guys gets revealed to you at some point in the game, and I thought they were such weak reasons that I assumed that they'd be elaborated on further, like that couldn't just be it. It couldn't just be that. And so I spent the entire game waiting for further elaboration, and it just never came. The ending came, and I was just like, oh really, that was it. Apart from that, there isn't actually much wrong with the story. It's perfectly serviceable. My issue with it was that it's dwarfed by the scope of the conflict that they're embroiled in. By the end of the game, you realize that the scope is so large that the individual struggles you've been going through in this game matter a lot less in comparison. You're always in the thrall of one prophecy or another, and your accomplishments never really surprise anyone. All of your actions and your accomplishments that you make in the game seem to be well within the expectations of the greater powers in the game, including that of the main villain. Even at the very end, where the scope of the game just jumps to an enormous degree, and you beat the final bad guy, in the big scheme of the game's lore, you've accomplished very little. And it's a double-edged sword because it does wonders for the lore of the shared universe. It's extremely cool when you start making connections between The Messenger and Sea of Stars, but it also made me feel like the story of Sea of Stars was less impactful as a result. That's really all I'm willing to say at the moment. I don't want to risk spoiling anymore. You'll have to see what I'm talking about if you decide to play it. But that's the end of my review. The game is overall very fun. It's extremely polished. It's a fine example of what made Chrono Trigger and games like it so good. My only real complaints is that there are narrative choices that didn't land for me specifically. That's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.